So my father decided that in the American system, the decisive points, evangelistically speaking, were major universities in small towns. The small town made it feasible, and the university made it important. Mm-hmm. And he then found out through a series of circumstances that Moscow, Idaho, and Pullman, Washington were two small towns, 8 miles apart, with a major university in each one, Washington State and University of Idaho.
Yeah.
And so he moved there in order to have a disproportionate impact.
Yeah.
That was the whole idea, is disproportionate impact. And everything that's coming out of Moscow is all downstream from that decision of his, whether it's Canon Press or New St. Andrews College or Logos School or Christ Church or the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches that came out, originated there, and the ongoing application of the principles of war. So, for example, using media, podcasts, this is a good example of the application of mobility.
Yeah.
Right. So the digital revolution has made it possible for us to get the word to New Zealand with a click.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Nick Solheim. I'm the COO of American Moment. I'm not joined by my Indian friend today. He has decided to leave me yet again for more fundraising travel. So you're stuck with me for today. But we are joined by a very interesting guest today, Pastor Douglas Wilson, who is rejoining Moment of Truth for the second time. And we discussed a very broad range of interesting things. But before I get to that, this is your quick reminder to go back to AmericanMoment.org, check out all the different things we have going on. We've got a new program starting up here in the fall. Make sure you go and apply for that. If you want to get in touch with any of us and learn about how we can help you get an internship, maybe get a job in DC, get better connected here and further your career, you can go to americanmoment.org/join. If you fill out that form, a member of our team will be in touch with you, to meet with you, to hear your story, to learn about the issues you're particularly passionate about. And we will try to help you get the ball rolling on your career and get good people in government. So the reason we had Pastor Wilson back on today is because we're doing an event with him actually this evening, as of this recording, on the Christian case for immigration restriction. And the reason that we're doing that event is because the preponderance of Christian and Catholic groups in DC that do advocacy on immigration, it's largely of the open borders variety, as many people from foreign countries into our nation as possible. We have found that there is not a really good Christian case out there for reducing immigration, both legal and illegal. And so, like with everything else that American Moment does, we see a void and we do our level best to fit it. So we have Pastor Wilson speaking at that event tonight, and some of you may remember we had Pastor Wilson on the show very early on. I think it was episode 38 or 39 or something like that, almost 100 episodes ago. And we primarily focused on very high-level theory, Kuyperianism, sphere sovereignty, all of that, what he thinks about how Christians broadly should think about government authority. As I've spent more time with Pastor Wilson and the folks out in Moscow, Idaho, over the last almost 2 years or so, I've come to appreciate Pastor Wilson as a tactician and political thinker. And so that is the bulk of this week's episode. We focus on what makes institutions ripe for takeover versus when conservatives should innovate and start something new. We talked about his political evolution over time. We talked about why, generally speaking, ideological libertarianism is bad and you shouldn't believe in it. It was a very fascinating episode. He's really one of the best thinkers in the Christian world. I would certainly commend him to anyone looking to learn more about theology and how it applies to your jobs in DC, or how you think about politics or the way you vote, it's very solid stuff. You can access his blog at dougwills.com. Yeah, just really, really fantastic episode. I always love spending time with Pastor Wilson. And he is the pastor of Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho. He is a founding board member of Logos School, a senior fellow of theology at New St. Andrews College, and he serves as an instructor at Greyfriars Hall, a ministerial training program at Christ Church. He helped to establish the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches and has authored numerous books on classical Christian education, the family, the church, and the Reformed faith. After serving in the U.S. Navy in the submarine service, he completed a bachelor's and master's in philosophy and a bachelor's in classical studies from the University of Idaho. Pastor Wilson and his wife Nancy have 3 children and a bunch of grandkids. We will go now to Pastor Douglas Wilson. Pastor Wilson, thanks for coming on the pod.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
So it's been a long time since we've had you on the show. We're pushing almost, I think, 2 years now since we were out.
That's a long time in podcast years.
Yes, it is a very long time in podcast years. We have a lot more listeners than we did then. I actually think to this day that is the only podcast that we've ever done without video.
Okay.
We flew all the way out there, so now people get to see you in the flesh. So since it's been a long time since people have been introduced to you, give us the story of Pastor Douglas Wilson, where you grew up, how you ended up in Moscow, how you've kind of become involved in this, a little bit of a political sphere. Give us the story.
Sure. This is the telescoped or collapsed version. I call my hometown Annapolis, Maryland. I grew up in Annapolis. My father was a Naval Academy graduate, and after he got out of the Navy, he came back to Annapolis to open up a literature ministry bookstore on Maryland Avenue, right outside the academy. So I grew up in Annapolis, and my folks moved, I was there for the bulk of the time, spent a few years in Ann Arbor, but my parents moved out to Moscow in 1971. And I had just joined the Navy. So I joined the Navy right out of high school, and I helped them move to Moscow. That was my first glimpse of Moscow. Then I went into the submarine service for just under 4 years. And when I was done with my hitch in the Navy, I thought, well, I'll just declare residency where, I can declare residency wherever. So I'll just do it for Idaho and go to school there, catch up with my folks, and then go on to do what I was going to do. And what I was going to do was open up a Christian bookstore in a small college town. Like, that was my dad's strategy for strategic evangelism. And I'm going to go somewhere like Laramie or something like that. But got married, started having kids. We started Logos School. The roots went down pretty quickly, and that is how I wound up in Moscow at a bunch of ministries and opportunities were there. I began preaching at a small Jesus People type of church, which evolved over the years, and we're now confessional, Reformed, Presbyterian. Presbyterian, not Lesbyterian.
Very important.
Very, very important distinction. So that's it practically. I'm not from Idaho originally, but all my kids are, all my grandkids are.
Yeah. So what is it about? This is interesting. I had a conversation last night with this guy who's he's Catholic. He's involved in conservative politics in Canada. Works for the Conservative Party up there. And I was mentioning that we have this event with you tomorrow, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I know exactly who that is. I know all about Moscow, Idaho." The guy has never been a Protestant before, knows about you, knows about Moscow, generally what the scene is. Why is that? What's going on in Moscow? What are you guys doing out there that has made it such a kind of national thing to be known about?
Yeah, how come anybody knows? That's a good question. That's a good question. How does anybody know? A lot of it goes back to a decision my father made when he moved there. My dad, like I mentioned, was a Naval Academy graduate. He took classes at the Naval War College. And in the 60s, he wrote a book called Principles of War. And what he did is he took the military principles of warfare, mobility, surprise, concentration, things like that, and applied them to spiritual warfare. How do military tactics apply to the spiritual war that we're in? Mm-hmm. And one of the points in that kind of thinking is in any battle or in any war, there's what's called the decisive point. And a decisive point is a place in the line or a place in the battle or a moment in the battle that is simultaneously strategic and feasible, right? It really matters if you take it, and it's possible to take, right? So a target, evangelistically speaking, a target could be strategic, but not feasible. New York City, for example.
Yeah.
If we took New York for Jesus, it'd be all over, right? It's strategic, but not feasible.
Yeah.
We could take Elk River, Idaho for Jesus in a weekend, just however long it took to unload the moving vans. But when it was all done, all we'd have is Elk River, and it would be feasible but not strategic.
Yeah.
So my father decided that in the American system, the decisive points, evangelistically speaking, were major universities in small towns. The small town made it feasible, and the university made it important. Mm-hmm. And he then found out through a series of circumstances that Moscow, Idaho, and Pullman, Washington were two small towns, 8 miles apart, with a major university in each one, Washington State and University of Idaho.
Yeah.
And so he moved there in order to have a disproportionate impact.
Yeah.
That was the whole idea, is disproportionate impact. And everything that's coming out of Moscow is all downstream from that decision of his, whether it's Canon Press or New St. Andrews College or Logos School or Christ Church or the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches that came out, originated there, ACCS, Association of Classical Christian Schools. There's a lot bubbling up, and it's gone everywhere, but it was basically how can you get the biggest bang for your buck?
Yeah.
And I think it had to do with the selection of that strategic location and the ongoing application of the principles of war. Mm-hmm. So, for example, using media, podcasts, this is a good example of the application of mobility.
Yeah.
Right. So the digital revolution has made it possible for us to get the word to New Zealand with a click.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So how has that project, generally speaking, been going? And this is kind of a leading question because I've been out there, and it's very interesting that main strip. Most of the businesses are owned by church members. You've got the Canon Press building. You've got New St. Andrews. You've got the theater. That Christ Church has been in. What has been the progress over the last few decades that you've been out there?
Well, it's been quite striking. Every time I felt for years, and this is I felt for years like we were ratcheting up to the top of a roller coaster, and I think, okay, brace for this. It's going to be a wild ride. But then, and then exciting and exhilarating things happen, but I still feel that way. Like I still feel like, okay, we're still building. We've not hit a crescendo yet. The basic setup or lay of the land has been, as soon as we got big enough to be noticed by the local, I call them intoleristas. There's the hard left intolerista group. Then there's the typical residents who don't have a dog in the fight, really. And then there is the growing community of Kirkers, we call them. Mm-hmm. So right now, the Kirker community is about 10% of the whole population. Wow. The intolerista wing is still agitated and angry, but still pretty small because they aren't having kids. They're sort of at the tail end of what their worldview demands. Yeah. And then you've got the people in the middle a number of whom believe the things that are said about us, but we've been under embargo by I would call the Big Eva and Big Eva types. We've been under embargo for a long time where you don't retweet that guy or don't
Yeah.
You can read them, but it's got to be under the covers with a flashlight. And so we've had that for some decades. And in the last 2 or 3 years, what's happened is the embargo has busted, has broken, because the establishment evangelical conservatives have largely discredited themselves because of lockdown, COVID, and rolling over for BLM stuff, and just a lot of things where a lot of Christians, rank and file pew sitters, came to the conclusion our leadership is not where we thought they were. We assumed that things were sound because we looked at the statement of faith. But when the pinch point came, a lot of ministries folded like a cheap card table.
Yeah,
and so consequently, a lot of people started hunting around for an alternative voice or leadership or who's speaking for me, and a lot of people found out about Moscow during lockdown, during COVID.
Yeah, we have even several members in our congregation in Martinsburg, which is 2 hours from here, that ended up attending, ultimately moving and becoming members of our church because we were the closest place to DC that didn't require masks. Okay. And it was like 2 hours, 2 hours away. I think you're right. This was a huge, I certainly started seeing a lot more of y'all's stuff as soon as COVID hit. Lockdowns were happening in churches, and it was kind of exactly like you said. You were embargoed, and as soon as you were standing up against the lockdowns and the masking and everything, everyone was like, well, I guess somebody's got to say it. We're going to start listening to this guy. I'm curious if you could give a bit of a history of y'all's resistance to a lot of the COVID regulations, not just in Moscow, but federally. And then the reason that I'm asking that in particular is because I want to know more about what the roadmap is for other towns that may be tactical or ripe for takeover, and build a roadmap for how small towns and even states can do the same thing.
Sure. I need to set the backdrop for a moment. I'm an advocate of liberty, but I'm not an ideological libertarian. Okay, it's Christ first, and liberty is a derivative of that, not liberty as the guiding. Liberty is a bad idol. Because she will betray you, but Christ sets people free. Because I'm not an ideological libertarian, when the panic first hit, and because I believe that the biblical law should be the pattern or the template that we recognize and follow. I don't believe that quarantining is necessarily tyrannical. If the Black Plague broke out in a small town near Moscow, I think the sheriff has every right to cordon the town off and say nobody comes out. And I don't think that that's tyranny.
Yeah.
So with that as my operating assumption, when the panic first hit and the lockdown was declared, we at Christ Church we held online services for 3 weeks, okay, because nobody knew anything about this. But after 3 weeks, it was becoming apparent that something fishy was happening, and that we were being played, and this was a panic. So and claims were being made about jurisdiction over worship and that sort of thing that we didn't want to submit to. So we went back to in-person worship on the 4th week, not requiring masks or anything like that. And I'm very grateful actually that we did that for 3 weeks, because if our church met down below the dam and some public health official came and said the dam's about to break, you need to evacuate, even though you're in the middle of the church service, I wouldn't ask, are the dam inspectors born again? Or
Yeah.
I would say if forest fires, volcanic eruptions, lava flows.
Those are things you want to know about.
I want to know about it. And if the fire chief says your church's roof is on fire, right, I don't have any problem evacuating. But if it's been a month now and the roof never seems to be burning and he keeps trying the same trick, well, we said, okay, that's enough. So we started to push back and resist in week 4. And as we got into it, it became very apparent that it was a panic because our little town was very not affected by COVID, and everybody was acting like it was the Spanish influenza, and it just wasn't.
Yeah.
And so so we were not complying from very early on, but I was grateful that we had done that for 3 weeks because it demonstrated we're not scofflaws in principle, right? But there's a difference between locking down a town that's got the Black Death in it and locking down everybody. In biblical law, the quarantining authority is of the contagious, of the diseased, of the people who have the problem. You don't quarantine everybody.
Yeah.
All right. That's overreach. And so one thing led to another, and the city council tried to tighten the screws and extend the masking order. And so we organized a psalm sing protest at City Hall. A couple hundred people came, and 3 of our people were arrested by the cops.
For singing outside.
And what we were doing was the ordinance that they extended allowed for exceptions of religious services and protests, and ours was both.
Yeah.
Right. But 3 people got arrested anyway, and then there was an uproar about that. It hit the cable news, Fox and stuff, and President Trump retweeted news of it. It sort of made a big cannonball splash, and then so. We, a few days later, organized another psalm sing. We did it again, and this time, like 500 people from the church came, and it was really striking, inspiring, because there were moms who were making babysitting arrangements in case they got arrested.
Yeah,
we're going to do this again. So, a couple hundred people the first time, 500 people the second time.
Surely they don't have 500 pairs of handcuffs in Moscow.
Sure, yes, it would overwhelm the system. So that sort of established us as stateside as actively resisting. In Canada, things were had gone down the road farther, and so when some of their pastors were arrested and they were having a showdown at a higher level, but we were sort of in the spotlight as resistors, active resistors, and a lot of people started listening to us as a result.
Yeah. So thinking about zooming out from even COVID, so things like doing a psalm sing outside of an abortion clinic or something like that. When the authorities try to shut things like that down, try to shut worship down, peaceful protests down, what is the roadmap for small towns and again even states? Is it just saying no? Is there more to it than that?
It's saying no. And I would remind everybody of this. In the American system, local politics counts for way more than you think, because when you vote for your congressman, you vote for your senator, you vote for the president, but it all seems, for most of America, seems very distant and far away. It's, the problems on the Potomac are huge, gargantuan. I don't even want to begin to think about it. But if you live in heartland America, the chances are pretty good that the sheriff is someone you went to elementary school with. Yeah. Right. And you go way back, and you know each other in different settings. And so consequently, if the people get their back up and say, this is not No. Let's think about it. No.
Yeah.
It's a real challenge to for the local authorities to clamp down in that situation because you know them, they know you. Mm-hmm. Right? It's far more adaptable, far more influenceable than the national political scene is.
Yeah. I'm very interested in, I think a lot of people think about you as a pastor, a builder of things, a theologian. But something that I've been particularly interested in is your thoughts on, political theory and tactics.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of particularly good things there that not a lot of people see or read about. And I'm curious to hear more about. And you may not think you've had one, but I'm curious to hear about your ideological evolution over time. You were talking about, not being an ideological libertarian. I think a lot of people probably think that is what you are or were. I'm curious to hear more about your ideological evolution.
Sure.
What you were reading, the things going on in the country. I certainly think that you've always had quite a bit of bite in your writings, but I certainly think it's more so now. So tell us about that. Have you had?
How did all that happen?
Yeah.
So I grew up in conservative North American evangelicalism. My parents were God-fearing evangelicals, very consistent Christians, theologically conservative, and they validated everything that they believed. They lived it out. And so there was never any question in my mind about the truth and veracity of the faith I'd been brought up in. Mm-hmm. I was just very comfortable there. So I was conservative theologically. Okay, that was sort of the baseline starting point. But also being a North American evangelical, things were pretty fragmented. In other words, there wasn't an integrated worldview component to it. Mm-hmm. And when I was in high school, as a result of a number of circumstances, I stumbled across William Buckley's book, Up from Liberalism, and read it. And Buckley made an immediate conquest of me largely because he was having fun.
Yeah.
Right. He had principles that were contrarian to the established liberal consensus. He was a wordsmith, and he was having a good time. Mm-hmm. And it was like, and again, having grown up in evangelical circles where there's a pious cast over every form of writing, missionary newsletters, everything's written by a committee with pious jargon. And it was not interesting. It didn't have grip. But Buckley was an interesting writer. Mm-hmm. And so in high school, I subscribed to National Review, started getting that. Well, that sort of established me in my conservative orient. I was dispositionally conservative, already theologically conservative, but I had this other track going, sort of political NR type of conservatism. And by NR, I mean NR in the 1970s, not NR.
That's going to be, I'm going to have a follow-up question about that.
Yeah, not NR now. Mm-hmm. I discontinued my subscription to NR a year or two ago. And it's just sad what's happened. But in the 70s, they really were robustly against the regime. Mm-hmm. And so I had that track going. Mm-hmm. And I began attempting to reconcile those theological conservatism and political conservatism probably in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan. Mm-hmm. In the late 70s, I started reading Francis Schaeffer and became acquainted with worldview, Christian worldview thinking. Mm-hmm. How should we then live, applying the gospel to everything? Was probably began through Schaeffer, and I wouldn't call it this at the time, but it was Kuyperian thinking where. Mm-hmm. The Lordship of Christ applies to every aspect of life. So that was Schaeffer was my gateway drug. And so skipping over through the 80s, I would say my political philosophy is an amalgam of influences. It would be things like Schaeffer's influence. I read a boatload of the Reconstructionists during the 1980s, and was influenced theologically and politically by them. I had a major influence in my thinking was George Gilder. Canon Press just released a documentary about George Gilder, and I would say that I'm a libertarian when it comes to what people ought to be allowed to do when they're manufacturing and selling and distributing widgets. If they're so I'm a free market guy. I believe free grace leads to free men, leads to free markets. But free markets are the freedom there is not an absolute, because market forces dictate the price of cocaine. Yeah. Market forces dictate the price of child porn, and you can't just throw it out there and say let the market decide. Adam Smith's invisible hand has to be attached to somebody, and that somebody is the Lord Jesus Christ. So I don't want to absolutize market forces, but I do want to say out of every lawful pursuit, farming, selling groceries, manufacturing things, people ought to be able to make what they want to and sell what they want to at the price they want to, and not be regulated to death. So there's a strong component of classical liberalism in there, but not secular liberalism. And so if you put it all together, I've called myself a theocratic libertarian. Right? God's law is supreme. God's word is supreme. I'm not an ideological libertarianism, because one of the things that ideological libertarianism cannot do is it cannot defend itself. Right? The individual free willer up against the Borg collective is going to lose. Right? He's just going to lose. And that's why the collective wants a nation of fornicating potheads, because John Adams said that our Constitution presupposes a moral and a religious people. He said it is wholly unfit for any other. So unless the people are virtuous, it's not possible to have a constitutional republic.
So I'm curious about the, your transition from, let's call it like the Bush era and conservatism to now, the Trump era of conservatism. You had this, neoconservative movement that was like nominally socially conservative, I think is the way that you could put it.
Lots of promises.
Lots of promises. You had the foreign wars, obviously. You have the offshoring of American jobs, manufacturing, that sort of thing, and those are things that were promulgated by a lot of these, like, it's a free market. How has your thinking kind of evolved on? I know that's kind of a broad question, but between economics, as particularly thinking about American jobs and manufacturing, immigration, foreign policy, social issues, etc. Because the Bushes versus Trump and now like kind of the Trump wing have very ideologically different views on that.
Sure. So when I look at things like companies building plants in Mexico, or
China is the predominant example.
China is now. But when I look at companies doing that, the first thing that I want to ask is who in charge here chased them there. If you had in 1950. In 1950, the most prosperous city in North America was Detroit. Okay. And the most prosperous city in Latin America was Havana. Okay. So I believe that things, you have forces at work which disincentivized corporations for working with the local authorities, whether it's laws about unions, laws about right to work issues, taxes, regulation, that sort of thing. So I would much prefer sort of a Jack Kemp approach to enterprise zones to keep companies from fleeing than the iron hand of thou shalt not.
Yeah.
Right. So the passing a law that says General Motors can't go here, I think is going to be futile and counterproductive and set you up for a lot of antagonism.
Yeah.
So I would much prefer to reduce taxes to a sane level, reduce regulations to a sane level, and stop incentivizing corporations to deal elsewhere. Right. Right. So now, having said that, the populist uprising that is not led by Trump, but which Trump represents, is a revolt that is not coming from nowhere. It doesn't arise from nothing. And when you look at Oliver Anthony's recent song, Richmond, North of Richmond, and how much traction that got overnight, somebody has to come to grips with the fact that our coastal elites have been swanking around for a long time and thinking they're better than flyover country. And we even have phrases like that.
Yeah. Flyover country.
Flyover country, where all the boobs are, and just don't say anything to get the chimps jumping. And well, they finally got to the point where the chimps got to jumping.
Yeah.
And now they're saying, what's happened to all our norms? No, you guys, I would say it was the ruling elites that I would lay the responsibility for this angry revolt entirely at the feet of the people who want to run everybody's lives for them.
Yeah.
I'd go back to a comment William Buckley said: if you're taking a shower, a liberal is a person who reaches in and adjusts the heat for you.
Yeah, that makes sense. Tell me more about specifically on foreign policy and immigration. Again, certainly most conservatives were in a completely different place in 2005 than they are now.
Right.
How have your views evolved on those issues?
Okay, so I would say I think what I'm about to say I would have always agreed with, but I think that the roster of failed foreign adventurous wars has given me more to argue with. Okay, so for example, I would be entirely hostile to nation building, where we're going to go and turn Afghanistan into a Jeffersonian democracy.
Yeah.
The answer to that is no, you're not. You're not going to turn Iraq into a Jeffersonian democracy. You're not going to. Constitutions are pieces of paper, and you can't just impose them on a people. So the post World War II secular jihad. Okay, there was a failed attempt. Woodrow Wilson wanted to make the world safe for democracy, but he was shot down on the League of Nations. And then after World War II, the United Nations sort of instantiated this desire again that we're gonna export the American way. We're going to export democracy, and that has embroiled us in a series of fruitless wars that I just don't. Not a fan.
Yeah.
Okay. Not a fan. Now, I at the same time, I'm not at all averse to a strong military, but I want the strong military to be used intelligently. And if there's a war, it should be short in order to preserve American interests, and then we get out again.
Yeah.
You attack the Somali pirates, and then you come home.
Yeah.
You don't try to adopt a secularist version of the Great Commission,
right?
Where it's not our job to make the world America.
Yeah. Here, Somali pirates. You should read this, Adam Smith. You would understand so much better if you read this. You brought up National Review a couple minutes ago, and I'm very interested in that topic. We had the former Attorney General Jeff Sessions gave a fellowship lecture a couple weeks ago to our, well, I guess it was like a month and a half ago, but to our fellows over the summer, and he was talking about he had a teacher in high school that recommended that he subscribe to the National Review, and so that was kind of how he got involved in conservative politics. But he shares a similar thought to you that they're no longer doing. They're not sending their best. We'll
Correct.
We'll put it that way.
There are people in that orbit that I still like. Right? There's some good people there, but they don't have the editorial discipline and worldview to hold it all.
Right.
To hold it all together. And so I could read, somebody might still write for NR and he might write a book that I really want to read. Yeah. But I don't want to read the editorial line anymore.
And do you think, the thing I'm most interested in here is, do you think you left them or they left you?
Oh, they left me.
So you think they've changed a lot over time?
They absolutely have. Cotton Mather once said, "Faithfulness begat prosperity, and the daughter devoured the mother." Okay, so what? Or in Deuteronomy, Jeshurun waxed fat and kicked.
Yeah,
you gain respectability, right? When you first start out, the initial issue of NR famously said, "We want to stand athwart history, yelling no or stop."
Yeah,
right. They're not doing that anymore.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
One wit said that if the Democrats proposed burning down the Capitol, the Republicans would counter with a plan to do it over 3 years. Right? The Democrats want to drive toward the cliff at 80 miles an hour, and Republicans want to go 50. But nobody wants to actually stop and turn around and do something entirely different.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, there are parts of Trump's agenda that I don't like at all, but to his credit, he did want to do something different, right? And that's why he's an enemy of the state, because he didn't want to go down the approved course, and so consequently, all the long knives are out. Because he's disruptive of the uniparty. That's his main crime. Is that he's disrupting the uniparty, and he's revealing the controlled opposition for what it is.
Yeah. So what do you think about institutions generally on the right or the left, and the sort of metrics that make them ripe for takeover, and also like how you do that, how you can take something like, say we took NR as an example, you wanted to reform it to be like it used to be, or how we are now, kind of bring them back to center. How do you think about something like that, and how do you do it?
Okay, so this is a very important point to emphasize. One of the things that conservatives and Christians especially can't copy the progressive playbook on this, because they get to be dishonest. They can wheedle their way into seminaries and lie. They can get into publishing houses and lie. They can sign statements of faith that they don't mean. And conservatives want to go to heaven when they die. They don't want to lie, cheat, and steal. And so consequently, anything that we do has to be done in a way that's clever but honest.
Yeah.
All right, so I would say there are times when an institution might be just getting on in years and is kind of decrepit, right? And so some people start coming, fresh blood, they've got young ideas, and the old timers are too tired to fight, and there's a takeover that way. Another a way is, and one of the things we've done in Moscow is we have started a number of alternative institutions. We have built a significant parallel economy, but the parallel economy is not necessarily one that you intend to run in parallel tracks for the next 50 years. One of the things that a parallel economy does is it introduces competition into the system. And if the competition starts to wane, right, they might go under, and then there you've taken over the space.
Yeah. Or
they might admit defeat and you acquire them. Right. So, so if you have, let's say, chatting beforehand, is Fox News redeemable? Well, left to their own devices, no.
Yeah.
But let's say someone starts a conservative news network that is what Fox used to be. Okay. And let's say it gains traction and it's head for head, keeping pace with Fox. It's conceivable that you could have some sort of corporate merger, takeover, and Fox be brought back into the family. A little inkling of this would be, who would have imagined 20 years ago that Tucker Carlson would upstage a presidential debate? Right. So what you're basically saying is that something that is operating on the level of a podcast, has taken on the sort of the establishment media and buried them as far as the numbers are concerned. All right. So at some point, what Tucker's doing is going to have to be institutionalized.
Yeah.
Right. And when it's institutionalized, what might it acquire?
Right.
Right. So I don't think you can have parallel economy forever. I think it's a competition, and at some point, someone's going to fold, or someone's going to be acquired, or admit defeat, or they will become the loyal opposition.
Well, I think so frequently, people, when they're thinking about this, they say we need to start the conservative X or conservative Y or whatever. Like, I think a good example here is like social media companies. Like we need to start a conservative social media platform that inevitably, does not get a lot of reach. And I think you have this with products too, certain kinds of, like, I guess there's this new like non-woke beer out there that's supposed to be like against Bud Light or whatever,
or Liberty Safe. I saw advertisements for they turned over codes to the feds, and now another safe company taking an opportunity. Maybe, probably not.
So what I'm curious about, and why I'm particularly curious about this, is because you guys have done this so well out in Moscow. What is kind of like the line of when it's best to take something over versus starting something new? Okay,
so when we were doing our thing, we were not taking over was not a thought in our minds. Okay, what we wanted to do was simply be left alone. We wanted to educate our own children. The first alternative thing we started was Logos School, and in a town our size, Logos has got like 650 students in it this year, which for a town our size, for a private Christian school, is enormous. And we are in effect a parallel school system. About a third of the school children in Moscow, about a third of them are receiving a private Christian education. And I think we're just a few years away from the government school system dipping below 50%, which I hope to see that before I go to heaven, where the government school system is the minority form of education. But we didn't start it in order to take them on, but in the providence of God, that's sort of what started to happen. And because our competition here is a government entity, not a free market entity. If it was a restaurant, the secular restaurant might close down. But the government school system is supported by the taxpayer and a lot of momentum behind it. So even if it dwindles down to next to nothing, it's still going to be there, right? So what we were doing is simply tending to our own knitting, minding what has God called us to do. We don't want to turn our children over. We want to educate them in the Lord. But as kids have grown up under that system, and we emphasize the covenant and extended family, and kids marry and they want to stay in Moscow, they want to make a living there. They have to make a living like everybody else does. But because of the worldview Christianity that we inculcate, they value entrepreneurship, aggressiveness, industry, creativity. And so a number of them started their own businesses and are just very active.
Yeah.
And so our people have to make a living just like all the people in the other churches have to make a living. There's nothing unusual in the system. So when Kirkers, the nickname for us is Kirkers. That's a long story, but Christ Church, and the Scottish word for church is Kirk. And in the early days of internet stuff, christchurch.com was too long. And so we shortened it to Christ Kirk and Kirkers. I named us that because if you don't name it, somebody else will.
Yeah.
And so our Kirker community is, let's say you're running someone starts a restaurant. I don't run it. I don't own it. The board of elders doesn't control anything. It's not a thing that the church is doing. It's a thing that people in the church, members of the church, are doing, operating out of a shared worldview. Okay, so there's an important point to be made here, is I distinguish theologically, I distinguish church and kingdom. So if you think of a medieval town, the church is at the center of the town, proclamation of the word and administration of the sacraments. The church is word and sacrament. And in the medieval town, all around are the bakeries and the bicycle repair shops and the software companies and everything. That's all in the kingdom. But it's not controlled by the elders. It's not controlled by the church. The people who run these shops acknowledge Christ, and they come and worship every Lord's Day, and they're taught to think in a biblical worldview. They're taught to behave like Christians, work hard like Christians, be honest and above board like Christians, and then they're sent back out into the town. So a lot of what people are seeing in Moscow is not church work, but kingdom work.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't run it. I have influence on it, but I'm not in control of it. I don't go to board meetings. I don't see spreadsheets. It's just the people of God doing their thing. Then there are certain things that I do have a voice on. I'm on the board of Logos School and so forth, things that we started. But a lot of what's going on, I just watch and I'm amazed.
Yeah. It seems to me like the answer here is actually provide, like if you were to, use a business term for this, like provide an actual good product.
Yeah.
Like your focus does not need to be on making conservative chocolate bars or whatever. It's like, I actually want to make the best product.
Yeah. Martin Luther said that if you want to be a Christian cobbler, you don't make shoes with little crosses on them.
Yeah.
Right. You make good shoes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Period. That's it. So I'm curious, we have a lot of listeners on this podcast, and not all of them, actually most of them are probably Catholics. But we do have, listeners who are not Christians, but are conservatives and desire, to have a conservative, distinctly American culture, which is, heavily influenced by our Christian history. What do you think non-Christians should be doing today to build that kind of culture?
Okay. So for those non-Christians who are watching this, and I understand they reside in that camera, I would say to you, non-Christians, you can't have the fruit and not have the orchard. You can't. This goes back to C.S. Lewis's famous quote in Abolition of Man: "We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful."
Yeah.
We remove the organ and demand the function. It's just you can't. I go back to John Adams' quote: "Our Constitution presupposes a moral and religious people. It is wholly unfit for any other." So basically, the Lord Jesus taught us that a house that you could have two houses side by side, and one has better curb appeal. They did a better paint job, everything, but it doesn't have a foundation.
Yeah.
Right. And the difference between the two houses is revealed in the storm. And that's what we've gone through the last 3 years. We've gone through a storm, and a lot of houses that had a lot of conservative curb appeal have collapsed. Right. And since I'm one who believes the storm season is not over yet, I think we're going to have other hurricanes making landfall. I think we need to come to grips with the fact that there's a binary choice here. I would say it's Christ or chaos. And if you're a non-believer and everything's about to hit the fan, if you say, well, okay, I don't want to repent and believe, I don't want to be baptized, but what do I do in the meantime? I would say you should move to where a bunch of people have repented and believed, because you're going to want to be around the nice people.
Yeah,
you're going to want to be around the people who care about liberty, who care about liberty of conscience, and that would include yours. Right? They're not going to string you up because you're an unbeliever. Don't believe the propaganda from the other side. The other side is far more intolerant than believers are. Liberty of conscience and religious liberty was a Christian invention. Right? It's something we hammered out. So for us to be accused by the secularists of, if you Christian nationalists, if you theonomists, if you theocrats get your way, then it's red dresses for all the women, and I'd say, come on, give me a break. You're the ones who are shutting speech down. You're the ones who are getting people fired from their jobs for their opinions.
Yeah.
You're the ones who are hammering people because they're not operating in lockstep with you. So don't accuse the people who invented liberty of conscience and developed it over a period of many decades and centuries even.
Yeah.
Don't accuse them of wanting to throw that away.
Yeah, there's I think a lot of the good influence in the conservative movement over the last I've really been active in politics in the last decade, and a lot of the good influence has been put forward by mostly Catholic conservatives, which is and again, God bless them for it. Like, it's great stuff. We need it. You know, we wouldn't have the victory in the Dobbs case if we didn't have
Catholics.
Catholic Supreme Court justices. So I don't want that to be misconstrued as like, this is, something we got to be worried about. The thing I'm in particular wanting to get at is why it's not Protestants, why it's not like general run-of-the-mill Christians. It seems to me there's kind of a two step trap here in that one, Christians seem to be generally averse to wielding authority, particularly in government. And then two, when they attempt to do so, it's usually not effective.
Right.
Why do you think that is?
So rewind and go back to the 19th century when the Catholic immigration started in earnest, when the Catholics started to immigrate here in earnest. America was overwhelmingly Protestant and evangelical in its founding. But in the 19th century, many, like the waves of immigrants from Ireland and other places, the Catholic infusion became significant. At that time, when the Catholics developed their parochial school system, they developed their parochial school system not because the government school system was secular. They developed it because the government school system was Protestant and evangelical, right? So to this day, a lot of Protestants think of the government schools as our schools, quote unquote, our schools. R.L. Dabney said in the end of the 19th century, Christians must prepare themselves for the following results. All Bibles, catechisms, and prayers will ultimately be driven out of the schools.
Yeah.
And we look at that and say, there are catechisms in the schools?
Yeah. That was on secular education, right?
Yes, it was. Yeah. So the government school system had a Protestant Bible, King James Bible. They had Protestant catechisms and Protestant prayers, not to marry, not to,
Yeah.
All right. So there was a trap, there was a trick there, because the intellectual energy for the establishment of the school system was Unitarian. Mm-hmm. But on the ground, local school boards, local schools were overwhelmingly dominated by evangelical Protestants. Mm-hmm. So Protestants have gotten it into their DNA that Protestant values are woven into what constitutes being an American.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the secular trap was sprung. The Catholics came and they said, we can't be part of that. They started a parochial school system that was distinctively Catholic over against the Protestant government school system. The Protestants were lazy, took things for granted, thought that everything was by and large okay. And then the secularist cancer metastatized and came to fruition in my lifetime, basically.
Yeah.
And such that the government school system today is unrecognizable, off the cliff, right out of the Sodom and Gomorrah stuff. And a lot of Protestants have sort of gone jeepers. Now, something I learned from my dad is always act, never react. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that there are millions of conservative evangelical Protestants who would be willing to be politically and culturally engaged, but they are like sheep without a shepherd. And Paul says, when the bugle blows indistinctly, who gets ready for battle? Mm-hmm. And you can see this in different waves. So, for example, in the 70s, you had the moral majority with figures like Jerry Falwell Sr. and Francis Schaeffer was sort of the brains behind the whole thing. There was a significant Protestant evangelical movement at that time it was Francis Schaeffer that basically pulled evangelicals into the pro-life wing, the pro-life camp. And it's true that the Roman Catholic thinkers, Supreme Court justices, are Roman Catholics, but it was evangelicals who elected the presidents who nominated those people.
Yeah.
Right. So if you take the evangelical voting bloc out, we're gone already. Mm-hmm. Right. So now, at the same time, I believe that there's this big untapped resource, because there are evangelicals who, over the last generation, have had deceitful shepherds, people who basically, liberals and progressives know how to go for the lymph nodes. They get into positions of influence and power, and they know how to operate the levers under the desks. They love headquarters of every kind. Mm-hmm. They love committees. So what's happened was, I would say, there have been resurgent conservative movements of evangelicals into politics and cultural affairs by the million, but we are consistently outmaneuvered.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think that in my lifetime, that's happened 2 or 3 times, where some promising movement of cultural engagement, finally, this is going to happen. And then everybody flakes.
Yeah.
The leadership flakes.
Yeah. So as a final question, I think one of the areas where both Protestants and Catholics have wielded a lot of influence in D.C., and I think in probably the wrong direction, has been on immigration in particular, both legal and illegal. You have a lot of, charities, nonprofits, lobbying groups that seek to basically get as many foreigners into America as possible, whether that's at the border, providing housing, encouraging them in this illegal activity, or drastically, increasing the amount of legal immigrants every year, and this is super, like, tens of millions of dollars goes into this every year. So we're hosting an event with you and a couple others this evening, which will be last week by the time people listen to this. But the topic is the Christian case for immigration restriction, how you can basically be a Christian and be for reducing the amount of immigrants, legal and illegal, we have into the United States every year. Give us a brief rundown of what you're going to say tonight.
Okay. So one of the illustrations I'm going to use tonight is, let's say there's a Christian couple who are particularly gifted in dealing with foster children, loving foster children, and they have 3 foster kids. Mm-hmm. Okay. And they're just good at it. And let's say that their local town council follows the imperative of tolerance out to the end. Mm-hmm. And social workers show up one day at this couple's house with 28 new foster kids that they impose on the family. Okay. And then let's say 5 squatter kids from the neighborhood join in.
Yeah.
Join in. So it's 33. So now the father complains. And Russell Moore writes an op-ed for the New York Times saying that Christian parents really need to get over their hostility to foster children.
Yeah.
Okay. Because the way of love, the way of Christ, is to take in foster children. Mm-hmm. And the dad protests. He said, before, I was loving 3 foster children. Mm-hmm. Now I'm dealing with 36. Yeah. I'm not loving anybody. Right. Don't talk to me about love. What you just did is you sank the boat. Mm-hmm. You took something that was doing some good, and you made it do nothing but bad. Yeah. Right. Now, so the issue is, I think ultimately, the issue is not, are you pro-immigrant or anti-immigrant? The issue is whether you're pro-chaos or anti-chaos. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I've been actively reading politics and, and 50 years ago when the State Department allowed, or whoever it is, allows a British brain surgeon to immigrate. Mm-hmm. Nobody cared.
Yeah.
Right. It was not, because it was not chaos. It was not chaos.
Yeah.
Right. What we have on the southern border is deliberately fomented chaos. Mm-hmm. And that chaos it's either being done through stupidity or malevolence, or perhaps a mixture of both. If someone says, let's have lawful immigration at reasonable rates where the immigrants can fully assimilate, right? And you don't have, when the dam bursts, it doesn't do any good to say this is an experiment in new methods of irrigation.
Yeah.
I would say it's not irrigation at all. Another illustration I use is the chaos of our times. Let's say you had a junior high school that had a food fight in the cafeteria on Monday and another one on Thursday, and parents are concerned and they're looking into the superintendent's management of the school. They would not describe it as a meatloaf crisis or a macaroni and cheese crisis. Yeah. Even though those were the dishes that were being thrown on the the problem is the rioting. The problem is the food fight. Yeah. Okay. The problem is the lack of discipline, the lack of order, the lack of law. And we have so many pockets of chaos, sexual chaos with the transing kids. We have the environmentalist chaos, not environmental chaos, but environmentalist chaos. Yeah. The climate cultist people. We have educational crisis. We have all kinds of crises, and the problem is we don't have a backbone, and we don't have a backbone because we're relativists. Yeah. And you can't stop being a relativist by saying, wouldn't it be nice if we weren't relativists? Mm-hmm. What you have to do is say, it's Christ or chaos. It's Christ or chaos, as we're discovering. So, I'm sorry you put the nickel in, but here's the here's the thing. After after World War II, when the secular establishment started plumping itself, swanking around, it was possible for a secularist in Eisenhower's America to say something that had a surface plausibility, which was, we don't need reference to the transcendent. We don't need to have a religious commitment. We're decent Americans. We can govern ourselves without reference to the Almighty.
Yeah.
Okay. And in 1958, 1962, that had surface plausibility. Astute biblical thinkers would say it's not going to last. Mm-hmm. But at the time, you could look up and down your street and say,
still here.
It's still here. There aren't drag queens reading at the library. Mm-hmm. There aren't 60 million dead babies. There aren't homosexual marriages being solemnized down at the county court. There was none of that. So there was surface plausibility. So I would say to my secular friends, how's it going? Mm-hmm. Right? We were very full of ourselves. We were proud. We had won the war. We split the atom. We won the war. Now we're not capable of splitting the boys and girls at a junior high dance. Mm. We have utterly lost our way. We are utterly befogged. And that's because relativism doesn't cut it. And the can-do American pragmatism is hoist on its own petard. Pragmatism doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't work. We have to acknowledge that we are not enough. We Americans are not sufficient. Look at us. Look at what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. I'm very much looking forward to that talk. I think it's going to be great. Pastor Wilson, where can people find you? Keep up with all the very important work that you're doing and learn more.
Well, for people to find me, if they're not a Fed, if the way we constructed my blog, I blog at dougwills.com, and the name of the blog is Blog and Mayblog. And if they go to the front page there and open up the front page and scroll down, there's a portal to pretty much everything I'm involved with.
Yeah.
New St. Andrews College, ACCS, Logos School, Christ Church. So if you go to the front page of my blog, you can get to pretty much everything I'm involved with.
Great. And they can access your list of controversies too, which I always find very entertaining.
Yes, there's a drop-down menu, and it's called the Controversy Library. It's actually important to say this. If you Google my name, beware.
Yeah. I've sent many people, when I've talked about you, I've sent them that page, the explanation. Yeah. Don't look them up, just read this.
Yeah. The Controversy Library, basically we've had every manner of dead cat thrown at us.
Yeah.
And all kinds of lies. And so we've got a Controversy Library. If you hear something, if you're starting to read our stuff and your Aunt Millie is kind of concerned because she Googled something, the Controversy Library has basically a response to every one of the
great
controversies.
You'll have to add a Rod Dreher category soon on there.
Yeah, probably. Yes.
Oh, man. All right. Well, Pastor Wilson, thank you very much for coming on the podcast yet again.
Yeah. Happy to.
Thank you again for listening to another fantastic episode of Moment of Truth. Once again, you can check out everything that Pastor Wilson is doing at dougwills.com. As for American Moment, you can help by rating and reviewing this podcast. 5 stars only, please. Jake happened to notice the other day that I think it was something like 80% of the people that watch on YouTube are not subscribed to this channel. You should go fix that. If you're watching this on YouTube right now, please go to our page on YouTube and subscribe. As always, you can go to americamoment.org to hear more about what we believe in, what's going on, the programs we have coming up, etc. You can fill out americamoment.org/join if you want to get involved. As always, stay frosty, and we'll see you next week.
Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to americanmoment.org to learn more.